So in this video, I'm going to be talking about reconnaissance in Foxhole. Now, reconnaissance, if done correctly, serves as a force multiplier, right? So what that basically means is that if you do if you do this role in conjunction with other units like armor or infantry or even artillery, you have a multiplying effect on those units in combat. All right. So if you try to do reconnaissance just by yourself without any other kind of unit in play, you don't really achieve much. Okay. And hopefully by the end of this video, I will be able to explain what reconnaissance can and cannot do and how it has a positive effect on combat units on the front line. Now, okay, so in general, what is reconnaissance? It's basically going around and looking for things, all right? Usually, the two main things that you're looking for is the enemy and scouting out the terrain. Now, you want to find the enemy because you need to know how many there are, what kind of weapons they have, how many tanks, are they deploying artillery. Sometimes you can, depending on the situation, might be able to identify specific enemy regiments where they're operating and at what times they operate in and on which fronts. Basically, that's a little bit more advanced, but that's the kind of extent that reconnaissance can actually go to. It's very in depth if you take the time to look into it and practice trying to do reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Terrain is important because if you're working in a large regiment or a multi-regiment operation, all the different units like the infantry, the armor, the artillery, they all need to know what the battlefield looks like so that they can plan and maneuver themselves. Now, why is it important? Now, the first bullet point here basically sums it up. In any kind of like war game, if you can't see the enemy, you can't hit him, right? But more importantly, if you are able to do the reconnaissance job well and correctly, you provide enough information to friendly forces that they now can act and react to the enemy more effectively. All right, it's all basically around maneuvering for the most part and applying our strengths to the enemy's weaknesses. You're there to find out what the enemy has, what they don't have. This can be both in terms of the enemy force composition or also their disposition, how they're deployed on the battlefield. If you can provide all this information to the commander of your friendly forces, then they will be able to exploit all these weaknesses and win the battle. Now, in Foxhole, reconnaissance and intelligence, they sort of like take two kind of main forms. So the primary one that we're going to be talking about for the most part is what we consider to be visual scouting. All right. The other form is map intelligence, which is the watchtower coverage. Whenever you open up your map, if you have a radio equipped, you'll be able to see all the dots and triangles that are moving around on the map, as so long as they are within a object that gathers intelligence. I will be discussing the pros and cons of map intel and visual scouting and how they work together, but for the most part, we're focusing on the visual aspect here of scouting, meaning that you have to go out onto the battlefield and take a look around and report back. I'm going to walk you through the general kind of operations and procedures that reconnaissance, what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to work. Okay, so let's go down to the basics, the fundamentals of the game, really, and we'll work our way from up there. So I'm going to hop into the game and sort of show and illustrate what it is that I'm trying to get across here. But basically, Foxhole is a third-person shooter, all right? It's a top-down kind of game. It's not a first-person shooter. And that means that there are certain mechanics that, regarding vision, are a lot different than from other games. Now, what I'm going to be showing here is the use of aiming and the vision that the screen provides you when you're in the game, and also talk about the use of binoculars, which if you're going to be doing reconnaissance, binos are going to be one of your primary weapons to do the intelligence gathering for the most part. Okay, so now that we're in game, let me show what I'm trying to describe here. So this is our character right here in the middle, and the camera, as we can see, is all the way on top looking down, third person. Uh, the limits of your vision, if you didn't have a weapon of some kind, you'd be able to extend your vision by moving your cursor off to the side. As you can see here, my character is now displaced off to the right, but I've now gained vision on the left here. And that works for any direction, basically. Now, if I right-click and aim with my rifle and extend it out, so around about here is my maximum range of the rifle. And as you can see, I can see much further in this direction. And with any other kind of weapon, you can also extend the cursor out a little bit further, and you can gain even more vision. My weapon is out of range here of my cursor, but if we're talking just purely about vision, I can now look much further. Now, as you can see here, my screen is still tethered to my character, which is at the bottom of the screen right now. And this is one of the limitations with aiming with weapons or any other kind of object that you have in your inventory. If you try to use this method to gain vision, you're always limited by the player character. It always has to be somewhere on the screen at all times. Now, this is where the binoculars come into play. Now, the binoculars lets you see up to a range of about 120 meters, and it doesn't tether your screen to your character. So if I see here, I'm moving up all the way to around 60 meters, and the screen itself isn't tethered to my character. All right. Now, the pros and cons between this is that here in the binos, I get the azimuth and distance, which is very useful information. And I also get to move out much, much further than if I were to use just a weapon and just trying to aim with an object of some kind. But unlike a object or weapon, when I aim, as you can see, I get a larger field of view when I'm trying aiming with my rifle, right? That's because the camera pans backwards. So now I have a better view of my immediate surroundings this way. If I use the binos, on the other hand, I don't get that. All that the binoculars does is shift my screen across the map, across the field here, for example, but it doesn't pan all the way back, right? So technically speaking, if you try aiming with a weapon or an object, you actually are able to see more than you can with the binoculars. You just can't see further. Now, this comes into play later on if you're trying to use a vehicle of some kind, especially if it's like a Jeep for recon missions, or if you're tanking, this also applies. If you're using a binoculars, if your sole purpose is to keep a lookout, you have to understand that when you're looking through your binoculars, you lose your situational awareness around the immediate vicinity of your player character. All right, that's really important if you're utilizing a vehicle. If you're in a two-man scout team, your driver has to be the guy that keeps an eye out on your immediate vicinity of your player character, whilst you, as the spotter, is looking through the binos. And that goes same for tank crews as well. Now, when you're in combat, or if you're with a frontline unit of some kind, let's say an infantry squad, the unit will only be able to see what's around their immediate vicinity. All right. If the squad leader has a binos, then he'd be able to see out further to the range of about 120 meters as well, as we've demonstrated there. But more importantly, uh, what a dedicated scout or recon unit does is that they are not bound by sticking around the core combat units, right? They can go off to other places and go beyond the range of what the combat unit can see and look for an enemy and scout out the terrain, just like I listed in the previous slide. That's one thing that reconnaissance can provide, is that you can always extend the vision of whatever force you're operating with. Now, some people will come up and say that map intel can do that. There are limitations to map intelligence. One is that you're going to have to already have objects pre-placed, such as watchtowers or listening kits or observation bunkers, that kind of thing. Those have to be pre-placed in whichever area it is that you're trying to keep a lookout for, which you can't really have if you're in a combat situation in front line. You're not going to be able to find out what's on your flanks or what's behind the enemy that you're facing against. Map intel also doesn't tell you uh, what the units are that are on the map. Map intel can only show you if it's an infantry, which will pop up as a dot, or a vehicle, which pops up as a triangle. It can also uh, identify artillery. That's like an arrow shape kind of icon. But for the most part, you can't identify what exactly those things are. The vehicle could just be a jeep. It could be a jeep or it could be a tank. When you're looking at the map, you don't know. The infantry just show up as dots. You don't know whether it's a medic or it's a anti-tank guy or just a normal rifleman. The map intel can't tell you that. All that has to be provided by visual scouting. And that's what reconnaissance is in Foxhole, what it's supposed to do, is to identify all the details and provide as much information as possible to friendly forces.